All right, I want to get to the slavery issue because this one is so disturbing and so it's complex but easy to understand once you grasp it. Okay, they say Jefferson was not against slavery. He did not want to release his slaves. He was conflicted on this.
Well, not on releasing slaves.
No, he was conflicted on a guy who writes all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator.
Owning slaves.
Owns
He's conflicted.
slaves.
That's
He's
right.
conflicted.
That's right.
But again, it's like Al Gore flying a private jet, but saying that you shouldn't fly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But there's something else that goes on, and the critics say that he did not free his slaves. You say it's because he had to pay a fine and taxes.
Well, no, actually, I say that you could free your slaves at death. George Washington did.
Yes.
And I say that because of the laws, you couldn't free your slaves. And so they take that 1782 law where you can free slaves at death. And that 1782 law also contains a clause that says you can emancipate your slaves during your life. Oh, Barton left that out. That proves that he's trying to cook the books. And the point I make throughout the whole chapter is there's a whole bunch of laws Jefferson had to deal with. So Professor Throckmorton comes back, his whole rebuttal is based on that 1782 law.
By the way, Professor Throckmorton, what era of history is he a professor or a professor in?
You're talking the guy who's criticized me, who's a professor of psychology at Grove College?
Okay, yeah, so he's not a professor of history.
No, he's a professor of psychology.
Criticizing you because you don't have the credentials.
The credentials and the content.
Right, okay, got it, okay.
Yeah.
So the professor of psychology.
And he's recruited others to join in the fray, and so he's got all these academics that now his,
Okay, so anyway, he says that...
That clause of the law that Jefferson that says you could emancipate your slaves during your life, see, the problem is, I only brought 3. Let's go 7 volumes of Virginia law books here.
Okay.
He quoted the 1782 law. He just forgot to quote the 1778 law, the 1791 law, the 1793 law, the 1795 law, the 1798 law, the 1802 law, all the other numerous laws that dealt with it. And Jefferson had to deal not with one law. And so you've got this thing where he says, oh, you can emancipate your slaves if you want to. Got a quote here from a guy who corresponded with Jefferson. His name is Edward Coles. He was the private secretary to James Madison, a friend of Jefferson. He said, you see Edward Coles here. And he writes, Jefferson says, I've got to get out of Virginia. He says, I've only been principled against slavery, but have had feelings so repugnant to it as to decide me not to hold them, slaves, which decision has forced me to leave my native state and with it all my relations and friends.
Okay, leaving a state back then, remember, there's no telephones, there's nothing. There's no airplanes to jump on. And leaving Virginia, if you've ever lived in Virginia, I have, you're not a Virginian to Virginians.
That's right.
You know, unless you were born there, you're not a Virginian. Leaving back then is a very big deal.
Big deal.
Okay.
And he says, I have to leave all my relations and friends because unless I get out of the state, I can't free my slaves. Now, if Professor Throckmorton's right that he could have just emancipated them, then why didn't he? Because Jefferson wrote back and said the laws, plural, do not allow us to free them. Not one law. Professor Throckmorton quotes one. It's the laws.
And this is how I want you to understand this, America. If you're a small businessman and you try to go into business, they'll say to you, you can go into business, sure. But try to build your business. It's not one law.
That's right.
It's a series of laws that make it so financially obscene, you cannot do it. Why, when Jefferson died in the end, what was he concerned with his money? Was he concerned at all about
what money?
Yeah, exactly right. Explain that.
Now, see, what happened is if you free your slaves, another law said if you emancipate your slaves, you got to provide security bonds for certain types. And so we don't want slaves to be a drain on the state. We want free slaves out of the state within a year. If they come back in, we can... and so it's just really complicated. Jefferson doesn't have income. He had to sell his cherished library just to raise enough funds to be able to survive.
Listen to this, America. The Library of Congress, the original Library of Congress, he sold to the United States government. He loved it. He sold it because
he didn't have economic income. So how are you going to security bond all your slaves? And by the way, he inherited 187 slaves when he's 14 years old. So why didn't he just release them? Because Virginia law says if you're an adolescent, you cannot free any slave you've been given. You cannot emancipate any slave. I mean, so he's now got 187 slaves he's not been allowed to free.
But it's also slaves at that time were assets. If you lose your slaves and you have this big farm, you have nothing.
You know what else? I was told by a guy who has 2 masters on this. He said, well, the slaves actually, Jefferson didn't own, they belonged to the creditors. And so he couldn't sell the slaves because he was in debt so much that they actually had, he said, we were taught that from the very start in our, postgraduate stuff, that Jefferson didn't have the option because he was already in debt and the creditors had his slaves. So I haven't checked that out, but I do know it's a complicated thing. I do know we have, there were folks who freed their slaves, but they could provide security bonds, they had more money, they could do the things, they had smaller groups. Not Jefferson. It's really complicated.
David, in 40 seconds, anything here that anything that is on your heart that you want to share?
Truth wins out. I mean, that's why we put 768 footnotes in this thing. That's why we want people to go check the documents for yourself. Don't buy into what some critic says and what scholar says. Look, know truth yourself. Go get it yourself.
David's saying this. He's not saying this to anybody to go buy the book, because you can't buy the book anymore because they've pulled it off the shelves. They're going to recycle the paper or burn the book. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but they've pulled it off. Mercury has every intention of republishing this book with all of the updates in it, so you can see it. If you have a copy of this book, it's now a collector's item.
That's right. In the meantime, we do have it at wallbuilders.com, so we've still got some. We've still got it in stock.
Here's the one thing that I would add. David is a good man. I know some of the people that are coming after David right now, and they're good men too. There are times that we have a difference of opinion. There are times that, facts are facts, and we just have to come together and be decent to each other. Be together on things. We're all serving the same God. From Dallas, good night, America.